Chapter 1. The Moon's Lure. Miyu and stood at the edge of the old mansion grounds, the moonlight casting long shadows over the neglected garden. Her heart raced with anticipation. She had heard the rumors for years, whispers about a secret garden that bloomed only under the full moon, with flowers said to contain the secrets of the heart. But it wasn't just the garden that intrigued her. It was the enigma surrounding it, the mystery of what lay hidden behind the crumbling walls. She adjusted her scarf, feeling the chill of the night air. "This is it," she whispered to herself, stepping cautiously into the overgrown path leading to the mansion. The wind rustled the leaves, and the distant howl of a wolf sent a shiver down her spine. The mansion, abandoned for as long as Miyu could remember, loomed ahead. Its once grand stone walls were now overrun with ivy, the windows dark and empty. Despite the eerie atmosphere, she couldn't help but be drawn to it like a moth to the flame. As she reached the garden gate, it creaked open on its own, as though inviting her in. The flowers inside seemed to shimmer, their petals glowing faintly under the full moon. Miyu stepped into the garden, feeling an unnatural stillness in the air. The soft hum of the flowers vibrated in her chest like a lullaby. She knelt down to examine one of them, its translucent petals almost pulsating with light. "This is unreal," she murmured, reaching out to touch it. But before her fingers could make contact, a cold voice interrupted her. "You shouldn't be here." Miyu froze. The voice was deep, yet filled with a strange sadness. She turned to find a figure standing in the center of the garden, a tall, slender boy with silver hair that shimmered like moonlight. His intense, dark eyes met hers with a mixture of caution and something else she couldn't place. "Who are you?" Miyu asked, her curiosity piqued. "Why are you here?" The boy stared at her, his expression unreadable. "This garden is not for outsiders." Miyu tilted her head, defiant. "And who decides that? This is a public space, right? I have every right to be here." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "No, you don't. Leave now, before it's too late." Miyu's heart raced. Too late for what? The boy didn't answer. Instead, he murmured something under his breath. Miyu didn't catch the words, but the garden seemed to respond to his voice. Faint whispers echoed in the wind. The flowers began to wilt, their once bright petals losing their luster. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the garden, knocking Miyu off her feet. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in fear. The boy didn't move, watching her with an unreadable expression. "I warned you," he said, his voice colder now. "Go back before you're dragged into something you can't escape from." Miyu scrambled to her feet, her pulse racing. "What are you talking about? Why is the garden doing this?" The boy gave her a sharp look. "You need to leave. This garden is cursed, and if you stay, you might never leave." He turned his back to her, and with that, he walked away, vanishing into the shadows of the garden. Miyu stood there, heart racing, her mind swimming with questions. Who was he, and what was this curse he spoke of? The garden, once so inviting, now felt like a dangerous place. But something deep inside her told her she wasn't done yet. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The next day at school, Miyu couldn't stop thinking about the boy she had encountered the night before. She replayed their conversation over and over in her head. The way his eyes seemed to carry centuries of pain. There was something about him, something otherworldly. At lunch, Miyu sat alone in the library, going through her father's old journals. Her father had been obsessed with the paranormal, especially the legends surrounding Ayakami. He had once mentioned the moonlit garden in his notes, but the entries were cryptic and scattered. One journal, however, caught her attention. It detailed the story of a guardian of the moonlit garden. Miyu's fingers trembled as she read the passage aloud. The garden blooms under the light of the full moon, but its true purpose is far darker. The guardian, bound by an ancient curse, is destined to protect its secrets for eternity. To enter the garden is to risk becoming part of it, bound by its power. The guardian can never escape, and neither can the ones who enter. Her breath hitched as she closed the journal. The guardian, she whispered to herself. Could it be him? Was the boy she had met the guardian of the garden? She sat back in her chair, a growing unease creeping into her chest. She had to know more. That evening, Miyu couldn't resist. She returned to the mansion, determined to uncover the truth. This time, she didn't wait for the gate to open on its own. She pushed it open and walked into the garden, her footsteps tentative. But this time, the garden felt different, darker. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. As she made her way deeper into the garden, the flowers no longer shimmered. Instead, they stood still, their petals curled inward like they were protecting something. Kael, Miyu called out softly, the name escaping her lips before she could stop herself. She heard a rustle in the distance. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was him. Why are you back? Kael asked, his voice low but not unkind. Miyu took a deep breath. I need to understand what's happening here. What is this garden? And why do you want me to stay away? Kael looked at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. Because you don't understand. You have no idea what you're walking into. He stepped closer, his gaze softening. This garden is not a place for the living. The curse, it's not just mine. It's entwined with everything here. The garden chooses who stays. And once you're chosen, there's no turning back. Miyu swallowed, her heart racing. Chosen for what? Kael closed his eyes briefly. To be bound forever. Chapter 3. The Crimson Petal. The moon was full again, and Miyu couldn't sleep. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. About Kael, about the garden, about the curse. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something much bigger than herself. She found herself walking toward the mansion again. This time, she wasn't afraid. Her steps were steady, and her heart was determined. As she entered the garden, she noticed something unusual. A single crimson petal lay on the ground, its color so vivid it almost seemed unreal. She reached down and picked it up, but as soon as her fingers brushed against the delicate petal, her vision blurred. Suddenly, she wasn't standing in the garden anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere ancient. She saw a figure, a girl who looked strikingly like her, standing beside Kael. The girl whispered something, her voice barely audible. Promise me, Kael, don't let them take the garden. Don't let them take me. Miyu gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, and the vision vanished. She was back in the garden, the crimson petal still in her hand. Before she could process what had just happened, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around to find Kael standing behind her, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. You shouldn't have seen that. Kael's voice was tight, strained. I told you this place is dangerous. You need to leave. Now, Miyu stepped back, her thoughts racing. Who is that girl? Why did she look like me? Kael's expression faltered. She was someone I failed to protect. The curse, she's a part of it, and so are you now. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the mansion. You have to understand. There's no going back. Once the garden chooses you, it doesn't let go. Miyu's pulse quickened. What happens if I don't leave? Kael didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the garden, as if expecting something or someone to appear. The air grew colder. The flowers began to hum once again, and the ground trembled beneath them. "It's too late," Kael whispered, his voice filled with regret. Chapter 4. The Heart's Secret. The night was silent, save for the distant rustle of the trees and the occasional creak of the mansion's dilapidated structure. Miyu's hand still tingled from where Kael had touched her, as if a part of his essence had transferred to her skin. She followed him silently, trying to process everything she had just seen. Kael's grip on her wrist was firm, but his movements were slower now, as if he were trying to control his own unease. His face remained stoic, but Miyu could see the flicker of panic in his eyes whenever he glanced at the garden. They entered the mansion through a side door, the wooden frame groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Kael led her down a narrow corridor that spiraled into the depths of the mansion. The walls here were covered in old tapestries, their edges worn, but the designs still recognizable. Ancient symbols of protection, binding, and curses. Miyu's breath hitched as they reached a heavy door at the end of the hall. Kael stopped, looking at the door with an expression that bordered on reverence and fear. "This is where the truth lies," Kael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But once you know it, there's no going back. Are you sure you want to continue?" Miyu didn't hesitate. "I need to know. I have to understand. What's happening?" Kael took a deep breath, then slowly pushed the door open. Inside was a room unlike anything Miyu had ever seen. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their faint glow casting an eerie light over the room. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and atop it was a book, its cover dark as night, its pages seeming to shimmer with a life of their own. "This book, it holds the key to everything," Kael said. "It's the reason I'm here, the reason the garden exists, and the reason you're here now." Miyu stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the book. "What is it?" Kael's hand hovered over the book, his fingers trembling slightly. "It's the grimoire of the moonlit garden, the heart of the garden. Its curse, its power. Everything is bound to it." He looked at her, his gaze dark and sorrowful. "I was the one chosen to protect it, and I failed." Miyu frowned, her mind racing. "Failed? What do you mean?" Kael's face hardened. "The garden, it chooses its protectors, its guardians. We're bound to it, just like the curse itself. We can never leave. We are its keepers, but also its prisoners." He turned away, his voice low and heavy with guilt. "The curse has claimed everyone before me, but for some reason it hasn't claimed you." Miyu's heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean? Why haven't I been claimed?" Kael was silent for a moment, his back to her. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because, Miyu, you're not like the others. You're connected to the garden in a way I don't fully understand." Miyu shook her head, her mind spinning. "What does that mean? What am I supposed to do?" Kael finally turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know. I wish I could tell you what's happening, but I can't even save myself from this curse. The garden has a will of its own, and once it claims someone, there's no escaping. But you might be different." Miyu swallowed hard. "Why me? Why not anyone else?" Kael stepped closer to her, his eyes filled with an intense emotion that Miyu couldn't quite place. "I don't know, but I can't let you go back to that garden. Not now. Not after everything I've seen." Before Miyu could respond, a low hum filled the room. The air around them seemed to pulse with energy, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Kael's expression shifted from concern to panic. "It's happening. The garden. It's reacting to you? Miyu's heart pounded as she looked around. The walls seemed to shimmer with light, and the symbols on them began to move, swirling as if alive. The book on the pedestal glowed brighter, its pages turning on their own. A voice, soft and melodic, echoed through the room, though there was no one else present. The chosen has arrived, the one who will either break the curse or bind it forever. Miyu stumbled backward, her heart racing. What does that mean? What's going to happen to me? Kael grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know, but we have to leave. Now, but before they could move, a sharp sound pierced the air like 1,000 whispers, all calling her name at once. Miyu? The voice seemed to come from everywhere. It wasn't Kael's, nor was it the voice of the garden. This voice, it felt older, more ancient. Miyu, come to us. Complete the circle and unlock your fate. Miyu's body froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Kael, but his face had gone pale, his eyes filled with dread. No, Kael whispered, his grip tightening on her arm. It's too late. The garden has chosen you. You're part of it now. Chapter 5, The Garden's Claim. The air was thick with tension as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Miyu could feel something pulling at her. Something deep inside her that wanted to give in, to surrender to the call. It was as if the garden itself was reaching out to her, eager for her to embrace its power. Kael looked at her, his face twisted in agony. Don't listen to them, Miyu. You can't. The garden is trying to claim you, but Miyu couldn't tear her eyes away from the shifting symbols on the walls. They seemed to be calling her, begging her to come closer. The hum in the air was now a low, seductive melody, wrapping around her like a soft blanket. She could almost feel the warmth of the garden, the power it promised. Why is it calling me? Miyu whispered, her voice shaking. Why me? Kael's expression softened, but there was still fear in his eyes. Because you have something inside you that belongs to the garden. A power, a connection that no one else has. But Miyu, his voice cracked. If you accept it, you'll never be free again. You'll be bound to the garden like I am. You'll become part of its curse. Miyu's mind raced. She didn't want to be bound to this cursed place, to live in a world of darkness and shadows. But the pull, the call, it was so strong. She felt as though something deep inside her was awakening. Something ancient, something powerful. I don't want to be trapped here, she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. Kael reached out to her, his hand trembling. You have a choice, Miyu. You don't have to follow the garden's call. You can walk away. You can leave this place behind. But as he spoke, the hum grew louder, the voices growing more demanding. Miyu, come to us. Accept your destiny. Miyu took a deep breath, looking at Kael. She wanted to believe that she could escape this, that she could walk away. But the choice was never that simple. Chapter 6, The Heart's Awakening. The room was heavy with silence, save for the constant hum of the energy that surrounded them. Miyu's chest tightened with each breath, her heart racing as the voices grew louder in her mind. The pull of the garden was undeniable. Its call was seductive, promising freedom, power, and understanding. But something in her resisted, as though a small voice within her was warning her to stay away, to not give in. Kael's grip on her arm tightened, as though he feared she might slip away, drawn into the dark heart of the garden. His eyes were wide, haunted, filled with a desperation that Miyu couldn't ignore. You have to fight it, Miyu, he said, his voice trembling with urgency. This is the garden's power. It's feeding off your emotions, your doubts, your desires. It knows you're vulnerable, and it's trying to pull you in. Miyu shook her head, her mind swirling with confusion. But why me, Kael? What is it about me that the garden wants? Kael's eyes softened for a brief moment, and he sighed deeply, as though he had been waiting for this question for a long time. I wish I could give you a simple answer, but the truth is, I don't fully understand it either. He paused, as if carefully choosing his words. You're connected to the garden, Miyu, not by choice, but by fate. You have a bloodline that ties you to its power. It's been waiting for you, waiting for someone who could either release it from its curse or bind it forever. Miyu took a step back, her mind reeling from his words. Release it from its curse? Bind it forever? Kael nodded solemnly. Yes, the garden is ancient, far older than even I can comprehend. It's been cursed for centuries, and only one person can either set it free or ensure it remains trapped. You're that person, Miyu. That's why the garden chose you. A chill ran down her spine as the weight of his words settled in her mind. She had always thought of the garden as a place of beauty, a secret sanctuary hidden from the world. But now she saw it for what it truly was, alive, aware, and waiting for her to make a choice that could alter the course of her life forever. Miyu closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind. She had to think clearly. She had to understand what was happening before it was too late. But why now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why me? Of all people, I didn't even know this garden existed until a few days ago. Kael's expression darkened, his gaze turning inward. The garden has been searching for someone like you, someone with the right lineage, for a long time. And it has its ways of making its presence known. You were always destined to be here, Miyu. You just didn't know it. Before she could respond, the hum in the room intensified, vibrating through the very walls. The book on the pedestal began to glow brighter, its pages turning faster now, as if it were alive, as though it could sense the rising tension in the air. It's happening, Kael whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Miyu, the garden is calling you. You have to decide. You can't keep avoiding it. You have to choose. Miyu took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a wave of emotions crashing over her, fear, doubt, and an undeniable sense of longing. The garden's energy was powerful, its presence suffocating. But there was something else, something more. A feeling that this choice, this moment, was more than just a matter of survival. It was about understanding who she truly was. I don't want to be bound to this place forever, she said softly, her voice shaking. I don't want to lose myself to it. Kael reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment, Miyu found solace in his presence. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, painful sincerity. I understand, he said quietly. I understand better than anyone. But you're not alone, Miyu. I'll be with you, no matter what you choose. I swear it. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Miyu could feel the weight of his words, the sincerity in his voice. There was something between them, something she couldn't quite explain, but it felt real. A bond formed not just by fate, but by shared experiences, by the danger they both faced. As the humming sound grew louder, Kael's grip on her hand tightened. Miyu, you have to make your choice now. The room seemed to tremble with anticipation, as though the garden itself were watching them, waiting for her decision. Miyu's pulse raced, her breath quickening as the air around her thickened, the magic of the garden pressing in on all sides. She began, but before she could finish, a flash of light erupted from the pedestal. The book's pages flew open, and the symbols on the walls began to spin wildly. The voices, now louder and more insistent, screamed her name in unison. Miyu? And then the world went black. Chapter 7. The Awakening. Miyu awoke in a place that was neither the mansion nor the garden. The air was thick with a strange, ethereal glow, and the ground beneath her feet felt soft and unfamiliar. She was surrounded by endless fields of flowers, flowers that shimmered with light and seemed to pulse with life. She stood up, disoriented, her heart still racing from the events that had unfolded moments before. She tried to call out, but no sound came from her mouth. The world around her was eerily silent, the air heavy with a sense of waiting. And then she saw him. Kael stood at the edge of the field, his back to her. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she could feel his energy, his essence, wrapped around her like a protective shield. It was as if he was part of this place, part of the garden's soul. Kael, Miyu called, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. She took a step forward, but the ground beneath her feet shifted, and she found herself standing in front of the pedestal from the garden, the very same one where the book had been. The book was now closed, its cover dark and unyielding. A voice, soft yet powerful, echoed through her mind. You are the chosen one, Miyu. You are the key. The words filled her with a sense of understanding, as if the puzzle pieces of her fate were finally falling into place. But there was still so much she didn't know, so much she hadn't seen. The key to what? She whispered. The voice remained silent. Miyu's gaze shifted to Kael once more. The connection between them was undeniable now, and she knew deep down that whatever choice she made would not just affect her, but him as well. The curse, the garden, their fates, they were intertwined. Chapter 8. The Curse Revealed. Miyu's mind raced with questions, her heart still thrumming with the echoes of the mysterious voice. Everything was shifting around her, but one thing remained clear. This place, this garden, was more than she could ever have imagined. It wasn't just a realm of beauty, but one with secrets so deep they could alter the course of her life forever. The burden of that knowledge weighed heavily on her shoulders, yet there was no way to turn back now. As she stood before the pedestal, the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. She looked at Kael again, standing at the edge of the flower field, still motionless. His silence spoke volumes. He, too, was trapped in this place, perhaps as much as she was. Kael, her voice cracked in the silence, more desperate than before. This time, Kael turned, but his expression was unreadable. There was something different about him, a strange stillness in his eyes. The urgency, the intensity that had once defined him, was gone. You've finally awakened, he said, his voice soft but carrying a weight that made Miyu's heart skip a beat. This is the place, the true heart of the garden. It's here that the curse began, and here that the truth lies hidden. Miyu stepped forward, her feet light despite the heavy atmosphere around them. What truth, Kael? What curse? Her voice trembled, and she hated how vulnerable she sounded, but there was no more hiding from the reality she had stumbled into. What do you mean? What's really going on? Kael hesitated for a long moment, his gaze flickering away, as if he was struggling with something deep within himself. The garden, it's a prison. He began slowly, his words heavy with the burden of truth. Not just for the people who fall under its influence, but for the spirit that resides within it. A powerful force, one that, if left unchecked, can destroy everything. My role here has always been to protect it from being released. But I've failed you, Miyu. I've failed to keep you safe from it. Miyu's heart clenched. Failed? Kael, what are you saying? You're not making sense. Kael finally turned to face her fully, his eyes dark, filled with a storm of emotions. I was supposed to protect you, he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. You are the key to the garden's curse. Only you can either release it or contain it. And I was sent to make sure you didn't make the wrong choice. But now that you're here, he trailed off, and Miyu's stomach twisted in knots. Now that I'm here, what? Kael took a deep breath, stepping closer to her, his presence a mixture of warmth and sorrow. Now that you're here, the garden will try to break you. It will use everything in your heart, every doubt and fear, to manipulate you into releasing it. The choice is yours, but it's not an easy one. It never has been. Miyu swallowed hard, her throat dry as she processed his words. Release it or contain it. Why me? Why is it all on me? Because you were born with the power to choose, Kael replied, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. The garden is bound to you, Miyu. It recognizes your bloodline, and that's why it's drawn to you. It's been waiting for someone with your potential to either destroy it or bind it forever. And as much as I want to protect you from this fate, I can't make the decision for you. You have to decide. Miyu took a step back, her mind reeling. The weight of his words crashed over her like a tidal wave. But beneath that, a sense of betrayal began to fester. You've known this all along, haven't you? You knew what I was getting into when you brought me here. Kael's eyes softened, and for a moment, the storm within him seemed to settle. I never wanted to keep the truth from you, Miyu, but I couldn't tell you. I couldn't risk you pulling away from me, and I couldn't risk the garden finding out about you before it was too late. Miyu looked at him, torn between anger and understanding. Why didn't you trust me? He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Because this is bigger than us, Miyu. It's always been bigger than just the two of us. And if the garden's curse is released, it will consume everything. It will erase the world as we know it. I couldn't let you carry that burden alone. His words left her reeling, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together in her mind. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and yet she couldn't ignore the fact that she had always felt drawn to this place. There had always been something within her that felt connected to it, even if she hadn't understood why. Now, as the pieces fell into place, she realized that this was no coincidence. I don't know if I can make this decision, Kael, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's right anymore. Kael squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. I'll be with you, whatever you choose. I'll help you, Miyu. You don't have to do this alone. Miyu looked up at him, her heart torn between him and the forces of the garden. She couldn't deny the bond between them, nor could she ignore the pull of the garden's energy that was slowly consuming her. Everything she had ever known was leading her to this moment, the moment where her choice would either save the world or destroy it. Suddenly, the flowers around them began to glow brighter, the air thickening with an ominous hum. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Miyu felt a surge of energy rush through her. The garden was waking up, responding to the tension between them. Miyu, Kael's voice broke through the chaos. You need to make your choice now. Before it's too late. Miyu closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling over her like a cloak. The fate of everything was in her hands. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she whispered, but Kael's grip tightened on her hand, and in that moment, Miyu knew she wasn't alone. She wasn't just the key to the garden, she was the key to their future. You are stronger than you think, Kael whispered back. Together, we'll find a way. Chapter 9. The final decision. The weight of Miyu's decision pressed heavily on her chest as the garden around her began to tremble. The once serene atmosphere had shifted into something far more menacing. The flowers glowed with an otherworldly intensity, their colors now unnaturally bright, casting eerie shadows across the land. The whispers from earlier grew louder, their voices curling around her mind like tendrils of darkness. They urged her to make her choice, to decide the fate of the world and the power she held in her hands. Miyu stood frozen, her mind swirling with thoughts of her family, of Kael, and of the future she had hoped to build. Was this truly the moment where everything would change? Was she really ready to shoulder the responsibility that had been thrust upon her? The curse, the garden, Kael's warnings, it all felt like too much to bear. Miyu, Kael's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but steady. I know this is overwhelming, but you don't have to carry this burden alone. We're in this together. Miyu turned to him, her heart aching with uncertainty. His eyes, once filled with confidence, were now clouded with doubt, though his words remained firm. She could see the weight he carried in them, the same weight that had held him back from telling her the truth. Kael had always been a protector, but now, even he was standing on the precipice of an unknown future. What if I make the wrong choice? She whispered, her voice shaking. What if I release the curse instead of containing it? What if everything we've worked for, everything I've known, falls apart? Kael's gaze softened, and he stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out to gently hold hers. The truth is, there's no perfect choice, Miyu, but you have something that no one else has, the power to choose freely. And that's what makes you different from the others. Your heart is strong, even if you don't feel like it right now. Miyu swallowed hard, feeling the truth of his words sink in. She had always thought of herself as ordinary, just another girl caught in a whirlwind of events beyond her control. But now, standing in the heart of the garden, she realized that her ability to choose, her capacity for love, sacrifice, and hope was what set her apart. The garden wasn't just a test of strength, it was a test of the heart. As her mind worked through the possibilities, the voice from the garden returned, louder now, almost commanding. You are the key, the voice whispered, its tone silky and insidious. Release the curse, and you will have power beyond your wildest dreams. Imagine what you could do with that power. Imagine the world you could reshape. Miyu's skin prickled as the words twisted inside her. She could feel the pull of temptation, what she could do with such power, the things she could change. But then she looked at Kael standing beside her, and the pull of the garden's whispers began to fade. And if I choose to contain it? Miyu asked, her voice resolute as she turned away from the garden's seductive call. What happens then? The garden's whispers died down, replaced by a deep, almost sorrowful silence. Kael's grip tightened on her hand, grounding her as the world around them seemed to hold its breath. If you contain the curse, the garden will return to its slumber, Kael said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. But it will also remain a threat, one that may awaken in the future, if it is ever disturbed. It will never be truly gone, but it will be held at bay. And the cost of that decision, it will be heavy. Miyu closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she felt the weight of the decision sink in. She could feel the garden's power tugging at her, trying to sway her, but something within her, the part that had always believed in hope, in the possibility of change, held firm. She looked at Kael, and in his eyes, she saw the same determination that had always guided him. He had always fought to protect her, even when the path seemed impossible. It was time for her to make her own stand. I choose to contain it, Miyu said, her voice stronger now, no longer wavering. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with a power all their own. A strange, ancient energy pulsed through the garden, responding to her declaration. The flowers around them shifted, their glow fading into a deep, tranquil blue, and the whispers subsided, as though the garden was acknowledging her choice. But even as the tension lifted, Miyu could feel the heaviness in her chest, the weight of what she had just decided. Kael let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding, his eyes softening as he took her hands in his. "You've made the right choice, Miyu. I believe in you. We'll face whatever comes together." Miyu nodded, but the sense of finality lingered in her heart. She had chosen to contain the curse, to keep the garden's power at bay, but she knew that her decision wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges she could never have foreseen. But she wasn't alone. Kael was with her, and somehow that gave her the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled again, more violently this time. The air around them crackled with energy, as though the garden was resisting her decision, unwilling to let go of the power it had tried to claim. Miyu's heart raced, her eyes searching the horizon for any sign of what was coming next. "Stay close," Kael warned, his grip tightening around her. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." The sky above them darkened, swirling with clouds, as the garden seemed to come alive in response to Miyu's choice. The trees twisted and groaned, the flowers bending in strange, unnatural ways. And then, from the depths of the garden, a figure emerged, dark, looming, and impossibly tall. It was a figure shrouded in shadows, its presence exuding a sense of malevolent power. "So, you choose to contain me, mortal?" The figure's voice was a deep, guttural growl, filled with disdain. "You think you can control me? The garden will never be tamed. I will always return." Miyu's heart raced as the figure loomed closer, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. She could feel the intensity of its power pressing down on her, but she stood firm. "I choose to try," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I will fight to keep this garden in check, no matter what." Kael stepped forward, his hand reaching for the sword that had once been his symbol of power. "Together, Miyu," he said, his voice firm, "we will face whatever comes next." And so, as the darkness descended and the garden raged against its chains, Miyu knew one thing for certain. Her journey was far from over. Chapter 10. The Garden's Guardian. The air crackled with tension as the mysterious figure loomed closer. Its presence was overwhelming, like a dark storm cloud closing in, suffocating all light and hope. Miyu could feel her heartbeat quicken as the shadows stretched around them, casting an eerie, cold atmosphere over the garden. The figure was tall and featureless, a silhouette of pure darkness with eyes that glowed like molten amber. "So, you think you can contain me?" The voice of the figure rumbled, deep and filled with malice. It was the voice of the garden, but now it had taken on a tangible form, something dark, ancient, and terrifying. Miyu stood firm, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She gripped Kael's hand tightly, their bond stronger than ever. "I didn't come here to tame you," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her heart. "I came here to protect this world. You won't control it any longer." The figure's laughter echoed through the garden, sending a shiver down her spine. "Protect? You think you can protect something so fragile? This world will crumble, just as you will." Its form shifted, twisting like smoke, before it solidified into a towering figure before them. Kael stepped forward, his expression fierce, as he unsheathed his sword. "We won't let you have this world," he said, his voice a promise of defiance. Miyu took a deep breath, feeling the power of the garden thrumming beneath her feet. She could sense its anger, its frustration at being contained, but also its fear. The curse had been bound for so long, and now it was trying to break free. "I won't let it end like this," Miyu muttered, more to herself than anyone else. The garden was no longer just a place of beauty. It was a battlefield, and the curse was more than just a force of darkness. It was a living, breathing entity that fed on fear, on doubt. But it was also a part of her now. She could feel the power coursing through her veins, the connection between her and the garden, the strength of her will. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and it raised a hand, causing the ground to tremble. Dark tendrils of energy shot out from the garden, wrapping around Miyu and Kael. "You are weak, child. You cannot contain what has lived for centuries." "We'll see about that," Kael said through gritted teeth, rushing forward to strike. His sword glowed with an ethereal light, cutting through the darkness. But the figure's form merely rippled, as if the sword had passed through it without effect. Miyu's heart raced, and she focused on the power within her. The whispers of the garden called to her again, this time not with temptation, but with a strange, unspoken truth. "Trust yourself," the whispers urged. "You are more than the curse." The words resonated deep within her soul. She was more than the curse, more than the garden, more than the fears that had held her back. Miyu closed her eyes, centering herself. The garden, the curse, and Kael, all were a part of her now. She was its protector, its guardian, and it was time to prove that she could be strong enough. "Kael, stand back," Miyu commanded, her voice unwavering. Kael hesitated for a moment, but seeing the determination in her eyes, he stepped aside, nodding. "Be careful," he warned, his voice full of concern, but there was an understanding between them now, a shared bond of trust. Miyu extended her hands towards the figure, feeling the pulse of the garden beneath her fingertips. The energy coursing through her grew stronger as she called upon the forces of the garden, not to destroy it, but to contain it once more. "This ends now," she whispered, her voice carrying an authority she never knew she possessed. The garden reacted violently, the flowers and trees around them bending and twisting, their once beautiful forms now contorted in agony. The ground cracked beneath her feet, and a powerful light erupted from her hands, clashing with the figure's darkness. "You cannot stop me," the figure screamed as it reached for her, dark tendrils swirling around its form. But Miyu didn't flinch. She focused, channeling everything she had learned, every bit of strength she had accumulated. The curse was powerful, yes, but it was also bound by the rules of the garden. The garden was hers to protect, hers to guide. The light from her hands intensified, cutting through the figure's darkness like a blade through fog. She could feel the resistance, the struggle of the curse fighting to escape, but she wasn't alone. Kael stood beside her, his presence a grounding force, reminding her that they were in this together. "Together, we're stronger than this curse," Kael said, his voice calm, but filled with conviction. Miyu nodded, her resolve solidifying. "We're not afraid of you," she declared. "We will protect this world, and we will stop you." With one final push, Miyu channeled all of her power into the garden. The light that erupted from her hands was blinding, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. The garden, the figure, everything became a blur of color and energy. And then silence. When Miyu opened her eyes, the garden had returned to its peaceful state. The figure was gone, its form dissipating like smoke in the wind. The air was still, the once darkened sky now clear, and the flowers, once twisted in pain, were now blooming brightly as if nothing had happened. Miyu collapsed to her knees, exhausted but relieved. The power that had been coursing through her slowly faded, leaving her feeling drained but triumphant. Kael rushed to her side, lifting her gently into his arms. "You did it," Kael whispered, his voice full of awe and admiration. "You saved us all." Miyu smiled weakly, leaning against him for support. "We did it," she corrected, her eyes meeting his with a sense of shared victory. "Together." But even as she spoke, a lingering feeling of unease crept over her. The battle had been won, but the curse had not been destroyed. It had simply been contained, held at bay, for now. Miyu knew that their fight wasn't over, that there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time, she felt truly ready to face them. And with Kael by her side, she knew they would be able to protect the world they loved. Chapter 11. The Heart of the Curse. Miyu awoke the next morning, her body still aching from the exertion of the previous night's battle. The garden was tranquil now, but there was something unsettling in the air. The peacefulness seemed almost too perfect, as though it was a calm before a storm. She sat up slowly, the morning sunlight filtering through the thick branches of the ancient trees. But despite the beauty of the garden, the feeling of unease gnawed at her. Kael was already awake, sitting near the edge of a small, serene pond, his sword resting against the grass. His expression was contemplative, but the moment he saw Miyu, a gentle smile crept onto his face. "How are you feeling?" Kael asked, his voice laced with concern. Miyu stretched her arms and sighed, the weight of the past few days still weighing heavily on her shoulders. "I'm all right, but something's wrong. I can't shake the feeling that the curse isn't truly gone." Kael nodded, standing up and walking over to her. "I feel it too. It's not over. The figure may have been defeated, but it was just a part of something much larger. The heart of the curse is still out there, and we have no idea what it truly is." Miyu nodded, her gaze shifting to the garden around them. It had always been a beautiful, magical place, but now it felt like something was lurking beneath the surface, an unsettling energy that she couldn't quite grasp. Suddenly, a faint shimmer appeared in the air. Miyu and Kael turned to see a thin, glowing mist rising from the center of the garden, swirling like a storm cloud before it dispersed. The mist had a strange pull, as if calling them. Without exchanging a word, they both knew it was a sign. "It's leading us somewhere," Kael said, his tone serious. "We have no choice but to follow." Miyu nodded in agreement, her heart racing. This could be the key to uncovering the truth about the curse and what they had to face next. The mist led them through the labyrinthine paths of the garden, deeper than they had ever ventured before. The flowers and trees here were different, taller, older, with leaves that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow. The air grew thicker, and the further they walked, the more oppressive it felt. "It's like we're walking into the heart of the garden," Miyu murmured, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "But something feels off." "I agree," Kael replied. "We're not alone." As they continued, the atmosphere grew heavier, and the light began to dim. The mist that had guided them started to fade, replaced by a strange, low hum that vibrated in the air. The closer they got, the more intense the hum became, until it felt as though the very ground beneath their feet was alive with power. Eventually, they reached a clearing, and in the center stood an enormous tree, its bark twisted and blackened, unlike any tree they had seen before. The roots spread out like veins, pulsing with an eerie crimson glow. The tree was both beautiful and terrifying, an embodiment of life and death intertwined. "This is it," Miyu whispered, her voice trembling. The the heart of the curse. Kael stepped forward, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his sword. "I don't like the feel of this place," he said, his voice low. "It's like the tree itself is watching us." Miyu took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "We need to destroy it before it destroys everything." But just as she took a step forward, a shadow moved within the tree's gnarled roots. Miyu froze, her heart pounding in her chest. From the darkness of the tree emerged a figure, not unlike the one they had faced before, but this time it was different. It was smaller, almost humanoid in shape, its face hidden in the shadows of its hood. "You've come to seek the truth," the figure said, its voice cold and distant. "But truth is not always what you wish it to be." Miyu's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" The figure chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "I am the guardian of the heart. I am the keeper of the curse." It stepped forward, revealing its features, a face pale and emotionless, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. "And you, Miyu, are not the savior you think you are." Kael stepped protectively in front of Miyu. "We've already defeated the curse once. We will do it again." But the figure raised a hand, and the very air around them seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. "You think it is that simple? The curse is not just a force. It is a part of this world, a part of the garden. You cannot destroy what is bound to this place." Miyu's eyes widened. "So, the curse isn't just something we can fight. It's part of the garden itself." "Indeed," the figure said, its voice becoming darker, more sinister. "The curse is woven into the fabric of the garden. It is its lifeblood, and it will not allow itself to be destroyed." Miyu felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The curse wasn't something they could simply eliminate. It was part of the garden, part of everything they had been fighting to protect. "Then what are we supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure's eyes gleamed with a strange mix of pity and amusement. "You must choose. The heart of the curse is not something to be destroyed. It must be balanced. The garden will not thrive without it, but neither will it live in peace as long as it remains unchecked." Miyu felt a pang in her chest. "Balance. Yes," the figure replied. "You must decide. Do you accept the curse as part of this world, or do you risk everything to purge it completely? The choice is yours, but be warned. Either path will come with great sacrifice." Kael turned to Miyu, his face filled with concern. "Miyu, we've come so far, but is this the only way?" Miyu's heart felt heavy, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The truth was clear now. There was no easy way out. To destroy the curse would be to destroy the very essence of the garden, perhaps the world itself. To accept it would mean living with the dark energy that had caused so much suffering. But Miyu had always believed in finding a way to heal, not destroy. She took a deep breath, her resolve firming. "We'll find a way to balance it. We'll make it right." Kael nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Then we'll do it together." As Miyu stepped forward, the figure's lips curled into a smile. "You have made your choice. The path will not be easy, but it is your destiny. Now, prove that you can endure the weight of the garden's heart." And with those words, the battle for the balance of the curse began. The garden's true nature would soon be revealed, and Miyu's strength would be tested like never before. Chapter 12, The Test of Loyalty. The garden's heart pulsed with a new intensity as Miyu and Kael made their decision. The figure before them, its eyes gleaming with an ominous light, slowly faded into the shadows of the ancient tree, leaving behind an unsettling silence. The air around them seemed charged with an unspoken weight, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Miyu stood still, feeling the heat of the garden's pulse beneath her feet. "We've made our choice," she whispered mostly to herself as she looked around at the vast expanse of trees, flowers, and winding paths that now seemed foreign to her. The garden was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battleground, and the war for its soul had only just begun. Kael's hand rested on her shoulder. "We'll find a way to balance it. We have to—" His voice was steady, but Miyu could hear the flicker of doubt that lingered in his words. "But what if we can't?" Miyu asked, her voice cracking slightly. "What if we're not strong enough?" Kael turned to face her, his expression soft, but resolute. "Then we'll fight until we are. I believe in you, Miyu, and I'll stand by you, no matter what." Miyu felt a surge of warmth at his words, the quiet promise of loyalty that they had shared since their first encounter. But she also knew the weight of the decision was heavy. For both of them, this was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a test of their very souls. The trial begins. The mist reappeared, swirling around them, guiding them deeper into the heart of the garden. This time, the mist was darker, more foreboding, as if the garden itself was challenging their resolve. The path ahead was unclear, and the further they ventured, the more the air seemed to thicken with an oppressive force. Miyu and Kael moved in silence, both lost in their thoughts. They could feel the eyes of the garden upon them, the very trees and flowers seeming to watch their every step. The quiet rustle of leaves felt like whispers, voices carried on the wind. "Do you think the curse will let us succeed?" Miyu asked, breaking the silence. Kael's eyes were fixed ahead, his grip on his sword tightening. "I think the curse is just a part of the garden's history. If we can find a way to restore balance, we might be able to contain it, but the cost might be greater than we expect." Miyu nodded. She had always believed that balance was the key, never destruction. But as they walked deeper into the garden, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the unknown, and whatever awaited them would test more than just their physical strength. The Guardian's challenge. After hours of walking, they finally reached a clearing unlike any other they had seen before. The air here was thick with energy, the ground beneath their feet a smooth, polished stone. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone archway, its intricate carvings depicting images of battles, curses, and ancient symbols long forgotten. As they approached, a voice echoed from within the archway, low, deep, and filled with ancient power. "You have chosen the path of balance," it boomed. "But to maintain balance, you must prove your loyalty. The heart of the curse lies in your connection to one another. If either of you falters, the curse will consume both of you." Miyu felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she called out, her voice trembling. "The heart of the curse feeds on doubt, fear, and betrayal," the voice continued. "To succeed, you must prove that your loyalty to each other is unwavering. Only then will the garden accept the balance you seek." The archway glowed with a faint, ethereal light, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. A new challenge had appeared, one that would test their bond to its core. Kael's voice was steady. "We'll prove it. We've come this far, and we won't turn back now." The voice echoed again, louder this time, as the air thickened with the weight of its words. "Then face the trial of loyalty. Your love for one another will be tested. If you are truly devoted, you will pass. But if one of you falters, the curse will consume you both." Miyu turned to Kael, her heart racing. She knew what the trial was. The garden would test the very foundation of their relationship, the darkness that lurked in their hearts, the fears, the doubts, all of it would come to the surface. The trial of betrayal. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet split open, revealing a vast chasm of swirling darkness. From the abyss, shadows rose, taking the form of two figures, each one a mirror image of Kael and Miyu. The figures stepped forward, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "These are the shadows of your doubt," the voice boomed. "They are the fears you have yet to face. If you cannot conquer them, the balance will tip, and the curse will be eternal." Kael's gaze hardened. "We don't need to fight each other. We're stronger than our doubts." But Miyu's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the shadow of herself. The figure was an embodiment of her deepest insecurities, her fears of losing Kael, of being unable to protect the people she loved. The shadow smirked at her, its voice dripping with malice. "You think you're strong enough to overcome your own weaknesses," it mocked. "You've always relied on Kael. What if he's not the one you can trust? What if, in the end, you're the one who causes the downfall?" Miyu recoiled at the words. The shadow's voice felt too real, too personal. It was as if the figure could see straight into her soul. On the other side, Kael was facing his own shadow, a dark version of himself that represented his doubts about his worthiness, his fear of failing Miyu, and his constant battle with his own inner demons. The shadow of Kael sneered at him. "You think you can protect her? You're weak. You've always been weak. And when the time comes, you'll be the one to let her down." Miyu's heart wrenched as she saw the pain in Kael's eyes. "Kael," she whispered, her voice cracking. The shadow Kael turned to her, his voice now a chilling echo of his real self. "Miyu, you're too weak. You're the reason we're in this mess. If you had been stronger, none of this would have happened." The shadows began to close in, their whispers growing louder, more accusing. Miyu felt the weight of their words, her heart torn. But deep down, she knew that the only way to overcome this was to confront the truth within her own heart. "I trust you, Kael," Miyu said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "And I know you trust me. We are stronger than these doubts. We've come this far together." Kael's eyes softened as he turned to her. "And I trust you, Miyu. I always will." With those words, the shadows began to dissipate, the darkness retreating back into the chasm. The voice from the archway boomed once more. "You have proven your loyalty to each other. The balance can be restored. But the true battle is not yet over." Miyu and Kael stood together, their bond stronger than ever. They had passed the first test, but they knew the challenges ahead would be even greater. Chapter 13. The Final Choice. The air had changed. No longer was it thick with the tension of doubt or fear, but something more powerful. Destiny. The trial of loyalty had tested Miyu and Kael, bringing them face to face with their own insecurities. But they had emerged victorious, stronger, and more united than ever. The path before them was no longer shrouded in mist. Instead, it was bathed in a soft, golden light that seemed to lead them toward their final destination. The heart of the garden, the massive stone archway from the trial, now stood behind them, silent and still. Its power had faded, leaving only a lingering sense of what had been. "This is it," Kael murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "The heart of the garden." Miyu nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon, where the faint outline of a magnificent temple could be seen. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before, towering and intricate, its stone walls etched with ancient symbols and glowing with an ethereal light. This was the source of the garden's power, the place where balance could be restored, or lost forever. As they approached the temple, the doors slowly creaked open, revealing a vast chamber inside. At the center of the room was a pedestal, upon which rested a single glowing flower. Its petals were delicate, shimmering with an otherworldly light. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of something ancient and powerful, and Miyu could feel the weight of its significance. "It's beautiful," Miyu whispered in awe, stepping forward. "Is this the heart of the curse?" Kael stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers. "It's more than that. This flower is the source of the balance. It's the key to ending the curse, but also the key to what happens next." Miyu turned to him, confusion in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Kael looked at the flower, his expression hardening. "To restore balance, one of us must make a choice. We can either restore the garden and seal the curse, or we can choose to end it entirely. The curse is the garden's heart. If we destroy it, everything will fall." Miyu's heart raced. The choice before them was unbearable. She could feel the gravity of it in her bones. "So, one of us has to give up everything?" she asked, her voice shaking. Kael's gaze met hers, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Not everything, but it would mean one of us would have to leave this place behind, to end our connection to the garden, to the curse, and to everything we've fought for." Miyu's thoughts swirled in a storm of emotions. "If we end the curse, we end everything, don't we?" Kael nodded. "Yes, the garden will be destroyed, and so will everything connected to it, including us. But we will be free of the curse, free to live our lives without fear." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their decision. Miyu felt her chest tighten, the reality of the choice dawning on her. She had spent so long fighting for balance, for harmony, but now she was faced with the impossible decision: restore the garden or let it fall and risk losing everything. Kael spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Miyu, I've always trusted you. No matter what you choose, I'll be with you. But you must decide what's best for us, for the garden, and for everyone." Miyu took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could feel the connection between them, a bond forged through trials, fears, and love. She knew what she had to do. "We restore the balance," she said firmly, her eyes opening to meet Kael's. "We don't destroy the garden. We heal it. We've come this far because we've fought together, and we'll keep fighting for the future we believe in." Kael smiled, a mixture of relief and love in his eyes. "I knew you would choose the right path." Together, they approached the pedestal, standing side by side as they reached for the glowing flower. The moment their hands touched the petals, a surge of energy filled the room, radiating outwards, enveloping them in a powerful wave of light. The light grew brighter, until it consumed everything. Miyu and Kael felt the power of the garden rushing through them, the curse lifting, the darkness fading. It was as if the very earth beneath them was breathing again, alive and full of hope. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The chamber was calm. The flower had bloomed, its petals now fully open, shining with a gentle radiance. The curse was gone. Epilogue: a new beginning. Miyu and Kael stood in the heart of the temple, their hands still touching the now still flower. The air around them was peaceful, free from the weight of the curse. The garden outside had transformed. What had once been a twisted, darkened place was now vibrant, full of life. The trees, the flowers, the air, all of it was healed. "We did it," Miyu whispered, her voice full of awe. Kael smiled, pulling her into a warm embrace. "We did. Together." The garden was no longer just a place of secrets and darkness. It was a symbol of their love, their strength, and their unwavering resolve. Together, they had faced the trials, confronted their fears, and made the ultimate choice. And in the end, it was their love that had restored balance, not just to the garden, but to themselves. As they stood together, watching the sunrise over the garden, they knew that their journey had come to an end, but a new one was just beginning, one where the future was theirs to shape. And so, with the curse lifted, Miyu and Kael walked forward, hand in hand, into a world full of possibilities, love, and endless horizons. The end.